It is for Ayn Rand's political theory that she is most famous today. Her novels, especially Atlas Shrugged, popularized her views on man, society, government, and individual rights. Ayn Rand challenged conventional assumptions about government, especially about what the role and the limits of a government should be. This week we are exploring that view. Welcome to week 29 of the Objectivism Book Study. I'm Cody Leibold, and we're starting chapter 10 in OPAR, that is Objectivism, the Philosophy of Ayn Rand by Leonard Peikoff. We're reading pages 350 to 363. The section headings this week are government, just the introduction, and then individual rights as absolutes. Now OPAR is about 460 pages total, and only about 62 of those pages make up these two chapters about political theory. This may seem a bit surprising, given the importance of the topic in Ayn Rand's writing, in both her fiction and her nonfiction. Now, I can see several reasons for the relatively short treatment on this subject. So Leonard Peikoff is aiming in this book to offer the essential ideas only for each branch of philosophy. He's able to overview the material, he's able to explain it in only 62 pages, 2 chapters, because the essential questions about what a government is and about what it is to do are not that hard to work out once you know the basic principle, and the basic principle is individual rights. Ayn Rand herself had a large output of nonfiction writing on social and political topics. As I understand it, Peikoff's goal in writing OPAR was to make sure to present objectivism as a whole system, and that involves going into relatively greater detail on the hierarchically earlier ideas, some of which Rand had not explicitly presented in her previous writing. So in other places in OPAR, we find the philosophical material that you do not find elsewhere. So that's why he had to go into such detail on, say, metaphysics or some issues on sense perception, theory of concepts. But now we get to the political chapters, and we're covering familiar ground if you're a reader of Ayn Rand. So this is the kind of material that already made it into her popular level speeches, her popular level articles. This is the kind of thing that you would write about, that you would publish in, say, the Los Angeles Times. You would see in Ayn Rand's work, people were interested in these topics, so she wrote a lot about them. If you were already familiar with some of Ayn Rand's articles, or even Atlas Shrugged, you might come to OPAR thinking, okay, great, it's going to be this tome on political ideology. But the political ideology in objectivism is only a small part of the complete philosophy. And objectivism, although you might think about it as a political movement, it's more than that. It's a philosophical movement first. And from that fact, it follows that objectivism has specific claims about the universe, about knowledge, about ethics, politics, and art. So to understand objectivism's view on each of these topics, you can just ask yourself, what would it mean to uphold reason, rationality, the reality-oriented mind? In metaphysics, that would mean accepting reality. Reality is something that exists. It's independent of our thoughts, feelings, or wishes. In epistemology, it means seeking knowledge by an objective, reality-oriented method. In ethics, live rationally, based on real-life observations and principles that are derived from observations. And now in politics, objectivism's unique view is that we need to live in a way that respects the role of the mind in society. So Ayn Rand's vision of a society is one that maximizes the ability of men to use their minds, because it is the active, unencumbered human mind that makes wealth, progress, happiness on earth possible for man. So Leonard Peikoff devotes 2 chapters to this overall topic of political theory. Chapter 10, Government. Chapter 11, Capitalism. And we'll be taking 4 weeks to get through these 2 chapters. As is his pattern in this book, Peikoff moves hierarchically, starting with what is most fundamental. And that means he's starting with the idea of rights. Objectivism agrees with Thomas Jefferson, Frederick Bastiat, and other thinkers in the tradition of liberty. Rights precede government. To secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, Jefferson wrote in the Declaration of Independence. That is not to be glossed over. This is a fundamental and historically revolutionary claim about government. It is to secure these rights that governments are instituted. All right, let's take a look at the book. We are on page 350. Peikoff writes, politics defines the principles of a proper social system, including the proper functions of a government. Living in a society is of value to man if it is the right kind of society. The wrong kind, like any wrong course of action, is a threat to man and can be fatal. Skipping ahead, he writes, politics rests on ethics. It's an application of ethics to social questions. So this is a subcategory. Think of Russian nesting dolls. Not every ethical question fits in the category of politics, but every political question does fit in the category of ethics. So what type of society conforms to or reflects the principles of morality? That's what we're asking. And you can get an idea of what objectivism's answer will be. It has to do with the role of the mind in human life. That will always be how they answer questions. So given the objectivist morality, the question becomes, what type of society conforms to the requirements of man's life? What type makes possible the virtues that we've been studying? The virtues, say, independence, productivity. What type represents the supremacy of reason? We'll talk about what rights are and what the validation is for rights. Peikoff spends several pages discussing just what rights are before we get to the validation. This is one of those situations where I think that if I were presenting this to my 7-year-old son, I would probably do it a little bit differently. But as adults, we've already become familiar. We've grown up in a society that has this concept. Put off your desire to get to the validation for just a minute, and let's just outline what the idea, what the claim is. The basic principle of politics, according to objectivism, is the principle endorsed by America's founding fathers: individual rights. So rights, states Rand, are a moral concept, the concept that provides a logical transition from the principles guiding an individual's actions to the principles guiding his relationship with others. We're not defining rights, we're talking about rights. Rights are principles about how people relate. It says the concept that preserves and protects individual morality in a social context, the link between the moral code of man and the legal code of a society, between ethics and politics. Individual rights are the means of subordinating society to moral law. So these are just some positioning statements. Now, here we have a definition. A right, in Ayn Rand's definition, is a moral principle defining and sanctioning a man's freedom of action in a social context. A right is a sanction to independent action. So when you say that something is a right, you are making a claim that somebody has the moral entitlement to do something. You are morally entitled to do something. If you say that somebody does not have that right, you say you are not morally entitled to do that. And in our colloquial use of language, we can say that, hey, you don't have the right to do that. And that's ambiguous. It's ambiguous whether you're saying that you don't have the legal right or the moral right. There's a reason for that. It's because it's a generalized concept. But if you're trying to understand what a right is, think of it as a moral entitlement. A man is morally entitled to his wife in a way that some other man is not morally entitled to his wife. A man is morally entitled to his vehicle in a way that the neighbor across the street is not morally entitled to his vehicle or his house or other belongings. It comes down to is a man's life and his freedom of action and his property and his pursuit of his own happiness. Those four things. Those four things fall all under one category of a man's right to his life. We'll see how those four different ideas come up when you try to investigate this concept of a man's right to his life. Peikoff writes, a right is a prerogative that cannot be morally infringed or alienated. In other words, somebody could steal my car, but if they did, they would be immoral. So that's what a statement about rights is. It's a statement about what's right and wrong. All right, so there's a context for this concept. The context of this idea of rights arises when you have people living together in a way that is not just hunter-gatherers. There's somebody that is from a different tribe and I happen across their path once a year. It's when there's a society where people live together over time, constantly in contact with each other. That's when you need to have these concepts, what belongs to me and what doesn't. When they decide to pursue systematically the advantages of living together, that's when they need the guidance of principles about what you can do and what you can't do. That's the reality that gives rise to the need for this concept. Top of page 352, you must begin by recognizing the moral requirements of man in a social context. You must define the sphere of sovereignty mandated for every individual by the laws of morality. I thought that was an interesting use of terms, considering the Kuyperian discussion about sphere sovereignty, but this is just a human discussion. This is human life. We have spheres of sovereignty. So within whatever sphere, the individual acts without needing any agreement or approval from others, nor may others interfere. So what belongs to you? What belongs to others? And what doesn't? I'll read quite a bit on these next couple of paragraphs and break it up a little bit as I go. So Peikoff writes, there is one fundamental right which has several major derivatives. The fundamental is the right to life. Major derivatives are liberty, he says first, and then property, and then pursuit of happiness. So let's talk about them in turn. The right to life. That means the right to sustain and protect your own life. So that means the right to take all actions that are required by the nature of a rational being for the preservation of life. So if you're trying to argue that something is a right, you have to show that it is required by the nature of a rational being. That's the reality grounding that you give it. The next point is liberty. So Peikoff writes, to sustain his life, man needs a method of survival. He needs to use his rational faculty to gain knowledge, choose values, then act to achieve his values. So the right to liberty is like the right to life applied to action. The right to liberty is the right to think and then choose and then act. Next, what's the consequences of that? After you've taken action, you're going to work, produce, you're going to have property. So we have the right to property. That's the right to this process of acting and then keeping what you have created. In Ayn Rand's definition, the right to property is the right to gain, keep, use, and dispose of material values. Where it goes ultimately needs to be your choice. And then what is another perspective on all of this action that we're describing? Is the broader, zoom back a little bit and ask yourself, why would a man do this? Well, it's because he's pursuing happiness. Peikoff writes, to sustain his life, man needs to be governed by a certain motive. His purpose must be his own welfare. The right to the pursuit of happiness is the right to this motive. It is the right to live for one's own sake and fulfillment. A historical note is in the Declaration of Independence. It speaks of the right to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. Originally, I think that there was a draft that said life, liberty, and pursuit of property. In Jefferson's mind, these three were big, but then he chose happiness because, I don't know, I think he thought that it covered the idea or that it was more elegant or something. Next material here, it says rights form a logical unity. So Samuel Adams has a quote here. He says that the rights are all evident branches of, rather than deductions from, the duty of self-preservation, commonly called the first law of nature. As we've discussed in the past, the first law of nature, the duty of self-preservation, means that you have the right to life. The right to life means to liberty, pursuit of property, and pursuit of happiness. Andrew, I saw you raise your hand.
So I recognize this actually from part of Bradley Thompson's book, America's Revolutionary Mind. And I was wondering, because of his statement, the previous page, about how if men just kind of interacted at random, there would be really no need for the concept of rights. Would you still agree, though, that rights are pre-political, do you think? Or is he just saying something that I'm not understanding? It kind of sounds like he's almost denying that rights are pre-political, that the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution recognize the rights that already existed. They didn't create the rights, basically. Would Peikoff, you think, agree with that?
I think that Peikoff would agree that rights pre-exist government, that governments are to preserve rights. But then there's a different question of, let's say there were Adam and Eve only. Did they have a concept of rights? Because they don't have a society yet. They just have two people. That's the issue that he was describing earlier. You have to have a certain number of people before it becomes necessary to have a generalized concept of, hey, this will belong to me and not you. So as soon as you have several people living together over the long range, then you have to ask yourself, wait a minute, is it okay if I go and take your thing and use it and break it? You have to start at that point creating principles for, hey, no, this thing is mine only. I'm going to put it here. It's going to be mine only. You're not allowed to touch it. That's when you have the concept of rights.
Okay. And this actually might reflect an earlier discussion that we had about realism of concepts, universals. It's at least bringing up to me the issue of, is it the same thing to say you don't need a concept of rights until you have a large number of people or a significant number of people interacting, as opposed to saying that's correct, but you still had a right before that? I don't think we need to get into that, but I think that's where my mind was going.
I agree. So we've had previous discussions like years ago where there were people on videos that would say, no, rights don't actually exist because for something to exist, it has to be a thing, a material thing. Rights are just ideas. And so you're right, this does relate to the question of realism versus nominalism. To summarize the answer, imagine that there's a hunter-gatherer society and that there's buffalo. And I go hunting for buffalo and somebody from this other tribe goes hunting and we cross paths. Can we have a discussion about who owns this buffalo? No, because there is no established rule about who owns that buffalo. That's all Peikoff is describing here, is we don't yet have a rule. We have not yet established property in this case, is all he's saying. The broader idea of how that relates to epistemology and concepts is there is simply no such thing as a right to that buffalo until there becomes a context necessary where the concept would be needed. And once you can demonstrate the need for the concept, then you can demonstrate that it's valid to treat it as if the concept is real, which may or may not be satisfactory to a realist. They'd have to provide some account for whether or not anybody had any rights to that buffalo before they ever saw it. There has to be something about human action that changes our categorizing, where someone encounters something, does some work hunting it. Like, so let's say I've been pursuing that buffalo and I've already thrown a spear at it. Maybe then I have the right. John Locke described it as a man adds his work, his time to the thing, and then it becomes his property.
If anyone's interested in that concept, look up a case called Pearson v. Post. It's about two men who were hunting a fox, and one person started pursuing it, another person shot it. And this was early in America in New York, and the judges had to say, we have to decide the rule. And so they looked back through history. So maybe that supports your view, Cody. And
Very
we
cool.
can talk about that later.
Okay, so we're at the bottom of page 352. So Peikoff writes that these rights, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, they've been misinterpreted, implicitly denied by today's intellectuals. They are still given some lip service in the West, but the right to property is regularly opposed on intellectual grounds in the West. It's a different story for this right to property versus, say, the right to free speech or association, religion, different things like that. The right to property is the one that is attacked. Why is that? Well, it's the one that if you could attack that one, then you could kill all of them. So Ayn Rand writes, just as man can't exist without his body, so no rights can exist without the right to translate one's rights into reality, which means to think, to work, to keep the results, which means the right to property. The modern mystics of muscle, who offer you the fraudulent alternative of human rights versus property rights, as if one could exist without the other, are making a last grotesque attempt to revive the doctrine of the soul versus body. Only a ghost can exist without material property. Only a slave can work with no right to the product of his effort. So we discussed this difference between property rights and human rights, which is this new kind of right. It's the claim that everybody ought to receive government healthcare and food and housing. When people say human rights, that's usually what they mean. That's different from property rights. In fact, it's exactly the antithesis of property rights. Rand, in her eloquent way, says whoever regards that as human and as a right has no right to the title of human. As a Christian, I agree with Ayn Rand. Man is an integrated being of mind and body. There can be no right to think apart from the right to act. That's the implication of this view. There can be no right to act apart from the right to own. So if you really do believe in the right to life, then you believe in the right to liberty. You believe in the right to property. That's the logical connection. In Ayn Rand's words, intellectual freedom cannot exist without political freedom. Political freedom cannot exist without economic freedom. Free mind and a free market are corollaries. And so that's the logical hierarchy of what we're discussing here. We've explained the concept, and now we're going into the validation. A lot more could be said about what rights are and what are the edge cases and things like that. That's not what we're doing here. So the validation. Now, I have a note in the margin here. This section could have been more clear. This is another one of those cases where I sometimes think Leonard Peikoff could have done us a favor and just started by naming his premises and then defending them rather than sort of leading us to his premises. Sometimes the sequence is a little bit confusing to me. I wish sometimes that he would make it more clear why he's moving from one paragraph to the next. That said, I think that the material is strong. And so it's just a question of you have to read through several pages and then think about it. I mean, it's not an easy task to do what Peikoff has done here. I couldn't do it better. And what he has given us here is all that is necessary to understand the material. So Peikoff writes, each of man's rights has a specific source in the objectivist ethics and in the view of man's metaphysical nature. So we start with this, man's metaphysical nature. From his nature follows the need for rights. So man is a certain kind of living organism, which leads to his need for morality, and it leads to man's life being the moral standard. That was what we discussed in ethics. So preservation of human life is our moral standard. If you can show that something is necessary for the preservation of human life, that's the same thing as saying it's morally good. Now we need to show that certain ideas about how people relate to each other are connected to preservation of human life. That's our task here, to validate rights. Peikoff writes, reason is man's basic means of survival, which leads to rationality being his primary virtue, which leads to rights, the right to act according to one's judgment, the right to liberty. He says, unlike animals, man does not survive by adjusting to the given, which leads to productiveness being a cardinal virtue, which leads to rights to keep, use, dispose of things one has produced, the right to property. And he says, reason is an attribute of the individual, one that demands as a condition of its function unbreached allegiance to reality, which leads to the ethics of egoism, which leads to the right to the pursuit of happiness. So he's showing how the different virtues integrate. He's not explaining it in great detail, but reason is connected to rational egoism, is connected to the pursuit of happiness. You see the logical connections there. Yeah, go ahead, Andrew.
Starting at the end of 353, man is a certain kind of living organism, which leads to his need of morality, and to man's life being the moral standard, which leads to the right to act by the guidance of the standard. And so he's obviously, like you said, he's not going through an exhaustive syllogism, but all I was seeing when I was reading this I've read this before, but for the first time this year, was, okay, so man needs morality and man needs principles to live by. And so therefore he has rights. I wasn't seeing, okay, man needs a lot of things. I need food. It's demonstrable that I need food. It doesn't prove that I have a right to food in the way that I have a right to my life and liberty and pursuit of property. I really like pursuit of property, by the way, because if they said life, liberty, and property, they might say, oh, we have a right, give me some property.
Right.
But pursuit of property. So I'll leave it there.
The question that we're asking is, in order for man to flourish on earth, what principles must he follow? Just like when we're looking at the virtues, we said it's necessary for man to be rational. It's necessary for man to be independent. Now, when we get to this topic of rights, when we say that something is a right, what we are saying is that it is necessary to observe certain policies in order for human beings to flourish. So when I say, yes, there is a right, don't reify that as like, where? Like, is it in this hand or is that hand? Is it a physical object? No. When I say there is a right, it's the same thing as saying it is necessary to follow this policy if you are going to live. I would tell you it's necessary for you to be honest. You say, well, where's the necessity? I'm looking to my left, I'm looking to my right, I don't see it. Well, think about the consequences of being dishonest. Likewise, think about the consequences of not observing other people's rights and not expecting them to observe yours. Long term, in principle, human society becomes impossible on any basis except for the basis that we're describing here. So we're talking about causes and effects. So we go to the middle of 354. All rights rest on the fact that man's life is the moral standard. Rights are rights to the kinds of action necessary for the preservation of human life. In other words, we're establishing a policy. We are going to preserve human life. We are going to make sure that everybody is entitled to take the actions necessary to preserve human life. Why? Well, because other people are values. As we've established in previous chapters, we should not initiate force on other people. That, I'm going to take that as granted in the discussion today. We're not necessarily going to retread the question of, is it okay? Is it good? Does it lead to human prosperity to go kill somebody and take their stuff? We assume that we know that that's not going to lead to prosperity if done on principle consistently over time. Knowing that that's the case, we establish a principle that says there are lines, there are limits to what I can do to other people. And so it is rational to establish lines, to say, because I know that it's not okay to kill people and to take their stuff, we need to make some rules here. It's rational to do that. That's all we're discussing. We're just saying we need rules. Rights are rights to the actions necessary for the preservation of a rational being. So as I go trying to figure out what my rights are and what your rights are, I'm going to try to be principled about it. I'm going to try to be consistent about it. And so I need to define it in such a way that there's nothing that I can say that I have a right to that contradicts what you have a right to. It has to be a system where there are no contradictions. Imagine if you were writing rules to a board game, say Risk or Monopoly. You'd have to look through your rules and you'd have to make sure that there's not a situation where one rule here contradicts a different rule there. Same thing with rights. I cannot have the right to hold slaves if you have a right to not be a slave. Those are incompatible ideas. Cannot have the right to medical care unless I would contradict your right, say you're a doctor, to deal with who you want to deal with and to work how you want to work. My right to medical care necessarily means that you don't have the right to free association if you're a doctor. He says that rights are rights to the actions necessary for the preservation of a rational being. All rights rest on the fact that man is a productive being. Rights presume that men can live together without anyone's sacrifice. If man merely consumed objects provided in a static quantity by nature, every man would be a potential threat to every other. In such a case, the rule of life would have to be that which governs the lower species. Seize what you can before others get it. Eat or be eaten. Kill or be killed. So we are assuming that we already understand that we are not in a dog-eat-dog world. We are assuming we already understand that the interests of other people are compatible with our interests and that it's not a zero-sum game, but rather society is a cooperative effort between people that can benefit each other where all gain. All rights rest on the ethics of egoism. Peikoff writes, rights are an individual's selfish possessions, his title to his life, his liberty, his property, and the pursuit of his own happiness. Only a being who is an end in himself can claim a moral sanction to independent action. If man existed to serve an entity beyond himself, whether God or society, then he would not have rights, but only the duties of a servant. I don't think this is particularly useful. From the Christian point of view, I mean, man does exist to serve God, but it's because God has created him to be in relationship with God. And when we say that God has created us to be a servant, that's part of our nature. living according to our nature is good. From previous material, you can see why I would think that this idea is not that useful. It says, if man existed to serve society, he would not have rights. I agree with that. To say that I have a right because I'm a rational being means you must also say you have a right because you are a rational being. Just keep in mind that we're talking about principles necessary for human survival as such, not just for me, not just the Nietzschean subjectivist egoism. But we're saying, in general, everybody needs this if everybody is to survive as a society. It's interesting because the objectivist is the only one that can look at the collective and have an objective view of the collective and say, let's look at what the collective needs. What the collective needs, what each one of us need, is that we would all collectively observe each other's rights. That's the common good. Let's go to the next section here. Rights are not self-evident. Now, here he seems to be disagreeing with C. Bradley Thompson. I think that Thompson is correct, actually. You could explain the idea that rights are self-evident, as it says in the Declaration, if you understood self-evident in a different sense than known immediately. Self-evident, as Thompson explains, can mean it's evident by deduction from the principle.
Thomas Aquinas also talks about self-evident can mean two different things.
Yes.
It's just helpful to think it's self-evident that men have certain rights. If you think in terms of you don't need to be taught from someone else. No one has to give you a bunch of history books to get that. It's available to anyone who thinks about it.
Yes. And of course, that point about self-evident, that's mostly just defending the style and the form of expression of Jefferson. It's not a huge philosophical issue, but I agree with Jefferson that it's available to everybody that looks logically at the issue. Peikoff writes, the rights to life, liberty, property, and the pursuit of happiness are the only rights treated by philosophical politics. I think that's interesting. He's specifying that philosophy is very general. It can only describe these rights in general terms. All right, we go on. The concept of a right pertains in Ayn Rand's words only to action, specifically to freedom of action. It means freedom from physical compulsion, coercion, or interference by other men. Since each man is obligated to be self-sustaining, no one has a right to the actions or products of other men unless he earns that right through a process of voluntary trade. This is a little bit compact, a little bit too compact for me. I had to read it like 3 times. Let's just take this one sentence. Since each man is obliged to be self-sustaining. Do we agree with that morally, that each man is obliged to be self-sustaining? Yes. Okay, so now it says no one has a right to the actions or products of other men. So I have a moral obligation to sustain myself. In that idea is contained the idea that I have no moral right to go take somebody else's things because I have an obligation to sustain myself, not to live as a parasite off of others. It's almost the same statement. You can't be a parasite. You must be self-sufficient. That's the same idea. Now, reviewing this paragraph, a right means freedom from physical compulsion, coercion, or interference by other men. Rights are just a perspective on independence and productivity. That's one way of looking at it, is to say that you have a moral right to your property means that I am morally obligated to be independent and productive and to not bother you and initiate force against you. So rights are intimately connected with the ethical concepts that we've already discussed. A man's rights impose no duties on others, but only a negative obligation. Others may not properly violate his rights. So rights are a perspective on the moral ideas that we've already established, that you should not initiate force on others. Like you had described, Andrew, in a previous discussion, rights are shadows cast by the obligations that we have, right?
Rights are shadows cast by duties. We'll say often in common law, you have a duty of reasonable care. You have a duty towards anyone you interact with. This is the way common law talks about it, to act towards them with a reasonable standard of care. You don't have to go out and above and beyond, but you can't just leave a bunch of nails in your neighbor's driveway and they'll have them run over it. The implication is if everyone else around me has something that they can't do, it sort of leaves a little shadow around me where it's like, oh, this is something that no one can do, so I have a right. It may not be a debate worth getting into, but it's sort of a debate of, am I barred from acting a certain way towards you because you have a right and that therefore the right is more logically fundamental? Or is the right the shadow that's cast by the more fundamental principle of the morality of what everyone else can do combined?
I would take the latter view.
Okay.
I would say that my neighbor has no moral right to drop nails on my driveway and pop my tires. And that as an implication of that, one way of looking at that is that I have the right to a driveway that's not been messed with.
Right. But
that's it.
You basically have the right to your property to not be interfered with. Yeah.
Yeah, my property and my life. It's as a consequence of the fact that he has no moral right to do that thing. And that's exactly how Peikoff has been arguing. That's why we started. I mean, which comes first hierarchically? That initiation of force is immoral or that we have rights? That's how I'd answer that question.
Yeah. Okay.
The right to life is the right to a process of self-preservation. And so he explains perhaps a misunderstanding that people might have. It doesn't mean that you have a right to free healthcare or something like that. It means that you have the right to take action to create your own values, not that you get to steal them from other people or have the government steal them from other people. Top of 356. If rights are defined in rational terms, no conflict is possible between the rights of one individual and those of another. Every man has the same rights. Now, this immediately tells us what's wrong with many conservatives today who would speak about the right to your religion. There's an article written by Albert Mohler several years back that says religious liberty is at odds with erotic liberty. In other words, the LGBTQ lobby thinks that there's such thing as right to this, this, and this. And as a Christian, we believe in religious liberty. And he says these two principles are incompatible with each other. And the way he frames it, he actually thinks that if you have a right to this, then you don't have a right to that, and vice versa. There's something troubling about the way he framed it. I have an article at my old codylibel.com website about that. You shouldn't speak of rights unless you mean real rights. You shouldn't say that somebody has a right to this or that unless you really believe that they do have the right to it. Otherwise, it's just a claimed right. And you need to distinguish between the rights that have their basis in reality versus the rights that are just made up. If somebody says they have the right to health care, I would immediately contradict them and say that's not a right. That being said, I can say that the purported right to health care is in contradiction to my right to my property. That is true. If rights are defined rationally, there will be no conflicts among them. If you find a conflict, that means that you have not constituted the rights correctly. He says that just as bad principles drive out the good, so false rights drive out proper rights. And that is absolutely the case. That's what we observe in society today. The right to, for example, be called whatever gender you say you are, that ends up violating the rights of other people to speak the truth. Peikoff writes, if my right to life entails a right to your labor or its product, you cannot have the right to liberty or property. Free milk for one part of the population, as one political theorist puts the point, means slave labor for the rest. The right to enslave, Ayn Rand says, is a contradiction in terms. It means the right to infringe rights. We have no trouble understanding any of that. There's a section here where Peikoff discusses economic rights. I won't go through that, but he rejects the idea of economic rights. We ought to establish rights based on what we've discussed already. There's no distinct economic rights. Also, there's no distinct collective rights, like rights for people of this specific gender or identity group. And then on 357, we read from Rand that a group can have no rights other than the rights of the individual members. I think this is part of what the problem with the civil rights movement was, is philosophically it didn't understand this idea, and so it spoke of rights for groups. And once you start speaking of rights for groups, you're laying a lot of dangerous groundwork.
I wanted to ask whether you think that there are any political rights that are different from these three fundamental rights. Like, are there any valid rights recognized by government that aren't these three?
I think it's four.
So four, yeah. Besides, okay, life, liberty,
property and happiness.
Happiness. Like, for example, would you agree that it's proper and accurate to talk about the right to be treated equally under the law? So not have a law drafted that treats different classes of people differently, or should we use a different word there?
I would see that as being an implication. Similar to if you were to look through the amendments, there's, the first couple deal with your basic rights as a human being, but then after that, it talks about your rights within the legal system. Like you can have an ex post facto law, cannot be required to testify against yourself. Those are implications, and those are not philosophical topics. Those are topics that should be not treated philosophically, but treated within the philosophy of law, which is the sub-branch of philosophy specifically for lawyers. Those are characterized as being part of your right to life, perhaps liberty or property.
But you can still see a big distinction there between that and sort of like a positive right on the work or something of other people.
Yes, and they speak of the right to a trial by jury, and that's a really big deal. But that's an implication. You could have a rights-respecting society that doesn't give you the right to a trial by jury. So, for example, in the time of the judges, if somebody committed a murder in the Bible, the elders in the gates looked at that and they said, well, here's all the evidence, you've committed a murder. it wasn't the person's peers necessarily that were looking at them, it was the elders. Would we say that that was not a rights-respecting society? So just zoom out and take the broadest philosophical view of the question, and you realize that the right to a jury of your peers is a specific application of a principle rather than the principle itself. Individual rights, Peikoff rights, are a redundancy, albeit a necessary one, because today most people don't know that there are only individual rights, so we have to say so. This next section is bad. This is just a bad section. He says that abortion is morally acceptable and legally acceptable because he says that there's a difference between a potential human being and an actual human being. And this is just a really weak argument. We've dealt with it in the past, so I won't go into it. But he gives this bad argument for why abortion should be legal, and then he tries to justify it by an appeal to consequence, which is also just a very bad method. So this next paragraph, he talks about how you'd be sentencing a woman to bear a child against her will. That's an unspeakable violation of her rights. What is the thing that you're trying to kill? That's the question. And does that thing have rights? If it's an inconvenience or if it causes suffering for the mother or the father, is that relevant? Can you establish whether or not that's relevant to the issue of rights of the unborn child? This is just very weak and cursory treatment, and the objectivist will never get any better than this. Let's go to page 358. He talks about the claim that animals have rights. He rejects that idea. It's from the capacity for reason that we have rights. So animals cannot have rights. Although we can speak of principles that society should enforce about how you treat animals. There can be just laws against animal cruelty. That's different from the statement, animals have rights. All right, we skip ahead to the middle, toward the bottom of that page. A man must respect the freedom of human beings for a selfish reason. He stands to benefit enormously from their rational actions. Now, as I read that, this is just in passing in a discussion of animal rights and things like that, but I realized that's something that he could have included a little earlier, may have been more of a fundamental point that we should have focused on. You ought to respect the freedom of human beings for a selfish reason because you stand to benefit enormously from their rational actions. That's part of the justification. That's not just a side note. That's part of the justification of why we should uphold rights, why we should not initiate force, is because it is a value to live in a human, civilized society. Next page. The rights of man, Rand holds, can be violated by one means only, by the initiation of physical force, including its indirect forms such as fraud. Now, this takes us into some discussions we've had in the past about how do you relate force and rights, and is it really true that individual rights are only violated by acts of force? And this even goes back to last year when we were doing the Americanism book study. The very first video, about at the 30-minute mark, we had a small discussion, and Andrew was there, and Jacob, and I think Isaac was there. And we were just talking about, if you're trying to create a taxonomy of the concepts, is it really the case that all violations of rights are connected to initiation of force? I think this was Jacob's contribution to the discussion. He said the ones that can be legally punished are connected to force somehow. There may be cases where somebody does something that's immoral, and you could say they've trampled your moral rights. But if you want to show that the government has business being in there, there has to be something physical involved. And so, yes, it connects to property, and it connects to initiation of force. Next section, it talks about how the Founding Fathers, they didn't have the worked out philosophical theory of Ayn Rand. So implicitly within the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, we have the theories that have been described here about right to life, liberty, property, pursuit of happiness, but we don't see it as explicitly as we would want. And as a consequence, eventually people began to twist the ideas and say, well, uneducated people could never vote correctly, and so it's necessary for the government to have government schools so we can make sure we have an educated populace so we can protect democracy. Well, this is an inversion of the idea of rights. To say that the government should be schooling people, teaching people what to think and how to think, it's like the most dangerous thing that you could ever do. I mean, it's my perspective and the objectivist perspective that government schooling is one of the major evils in society, one of the major contributions to the evil direction that society is going. Sadly, it was people that thought they were being pro-American that established that. It's also people that thought they were being pro-American and conservative that established the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890, which set a lot of precedents for there to be a Securities and Exchange Commission and for there to be federal government oversight of the economy. All of that contradicts the Founding Fathers' vision. Ayn Rand's discovery that rights can be violated only by the use of physical force is historic. It is essential to the proper completion of the theory of rights, giving men for the first time the means to implement the theory objectively. Now, what does that mean? It means that with Ayn Rand's description of what rights are, we are able to look at the facts of what people have actually done, the tangible facts. We're able to make observations and say, okay, I see that you did this. This is what happened. And this is why we have to characterize that as a violation of rights. We have definitions now. We have a concept for when somebody has violated somebody's rights and when they haven't, and we can tie it to reality. Top of 360. Ayn Rand's grasp in politics of the relation between rights and force flows from her grasp in ethics of the moral evil of physical force. That's the missing piece that people didn't understand. And how could you expect the founding fathers to understand that when many of them were slaveholders? They were starting to understand it, but it wasn't understood at that time to the degree that we have now. So force, her ethics teaches, is a form of action. And force is the only action which paralyzes and negates the victim's mind. It is thus the only evil that one man can perpetrate against another, which negates the victim's tool of survival, which literally stops the action of human self-preservation, which contradicts the right to live. Force contradicts the working of the mind. The working of the mind is necessary for life. Force, on principle, must be removed from human society. That's the principle here. Only the crime of force is able to render its victim helpless. The moral responsibility of organized society, therefore, lies in a single obligation: to banish this crime, to protect individual rights. So I think that the argumentation there is a little bit philosophically shaky. Just because force renders your victim helpless, does that necessarily prove that we must banish that crime? It could be worked out a little bit more. Interaction with that?
It would just be great if there were more clarity about the argumentation here. And I have kind of a comment to make when we're almost at the end of the reading tip, so I'll hold it. I think this whole section, I think I agree with you, Cody, this whole section could have benefited from some more clarity.
His overall point in that paragraph is we need to distinguish between doing something immoral to somebody else that hurts them psychologically versus physically. So for example, if I were to make a promise to you, Andrew, hey, Andrew, I'm going to take you to Disneyland, and then you travel all the way to California, and then I'm like, sorry, I'm busy. That's a jerk move. Peikoff is saying there's a difference between certain kinds of things like that that are morally wrong, but that you shouldn't be able to punish legally. And yeah, I agree with his validation there, but this would have been a great time to bring in the issue of vice versus crime. How do you know when somebody has done something that the government ought to intervene in?
You could say that my property was reduced. I mean, I spent money on that plane ticket and things like that. What if we had a contract? We had signed a contract for me to come and teach your kids a class on law. And I got there, I did the exact same thing. And then you got there and said, no, I don't really want to do this. I don't really want to pay you the money. You can just go home. You don't have to do this. It'd be different. I lost the same thing in both cases. So why is one an initiation of force and why is the other one not? I mean, that would be great to have in here.
Yep. Yeah, I agree. Let's move forward. Reason has one and only one social requirement: freedom. Such is the essence of the case for man's rights. Metaphysically, the individual is sovereign. He's a being of self-made soul. His purpose is himself. He lives for his own sake. Ethically, he is obliged to live as a sovereign and independent egoist. Politically, therefore, he must be able to act as a sovereign. There's something in what he just said there that would help address this question of, like, if I asked Andrew to come and be a tutor for my kids versus if I just made a social arrangement with him and flaked out. When somebody binds themselves with a contract and then you renege on the contract, you're depriving somebody of their ability to act in a sovereign way. Whereas if you just made an invitation, hey, come over to my house, and then somehow, like, I wasn't home, it wasn't like I deprived you of your sovereignty. There might be something there, something to do with your sovereignty, your property, those kinds of things. There is only one alternative to freedom: men's attempt to live while defying reason's requirements. This means the attempt to survive without the tool of survival. Rand writes, rights are conditions of existence required by man's nature for his proper survival. If a man is to live on earth, it is right for him to use his mind. It is right for him to act on his own free judgment. So to force somebody else is to destroy this basic need of man, this need of his survival, and it ultimately damages everybody, including yourself. This next section talks a little bit about the intrinsicist view. So now Peikoff is comparing his view to the intrinsicist and subjectivist. And the intrinsicist view of rights, I'm going to somewhat agree, somewhat disagree with his characterization here. So he says the individual, according to the intrinsicist who accepts rights, the individual is God's creation, therefore his property, not the collective's. And such an approach denies rights implicitly. It means that only God is morally sovereign. In practice, this leads to the conclusion that man on earth may be used and disposed of by God's representatives on earth. Now, I ask myself as I read that, like, okay, so in some sense, are we God's property because he created us? Yes. And do we have rights against our creator? No. Not in the sense of the kind of rights that we've been looking at grounded in observations of human life. We could have no claim. In the scripture, it talks about, is the pot going to say to the potter, why did you do this? You have no claim against God because of what we are and because of what God is. Additionally, we've sinned, and so God is morally just to condemn us. So we don't have rights against God condemning us. So I don't think that rights apply to God. I've thought about this quite a bit over the years. Do rights apply to God? We don't have rights against God. This description of what happens in a theonomy is correct. A theonomy usually works itself out with God's representatives on earth telling people that they don't have any rights. And that's a problem. And we've discussed that at FTNCI. We're strongly opposed to theonomy because we believe in freedom of thought, freedom of association. Next section, so he says no religious society has ever cherished or protected individual freedom, which is a purely secular value and achievement. You do realize that most of the founding fathers were Christians. It's a purely secular value and achievement? I don't think it is, historically. Now, that said, the founding fathers and the society that they were part of was fairly secular. So I'll grant him that. And when they wrote the Declaration of Independence, they did mention God. When they wrote the Constitution, they did not mention God. That's an important historical point. And even Alexander Hamilton, when he was asked, why did you not mention God in the Constitution? He just kind of laughed it off and said, oh, we forgot. I think that some of those founding fathers were proud about the secularism of their plan. Some of them were not. Some of them would have wanted the Constitution to have God mentioned. So it's a mixed case. And there's been arguments over the decades of just the extent to which the founders were religious and the society that founded the revolution was religious. But the American Revolution was called the Presbyterian Revolution for a reason. It was preached by the pastors. So the objectivists do not give a complete picture of the role of religious thought in the American Revolution. They just don't. They fail there. They do other good things, but this is not a good thing from them. It's interesting because Peikoff goes on and he says, rights contrary to the formulation common during the Enlightenment do not derive from man's source or creator. And here, just one sentence after saying that rights are secular, he makes note of the fact that the Declaration mentions the creator. I mean, did Jefferson mention the creator? Yeah, he did. Clearly, they thought that there was a connection. What's even more funny here is that I actually agree with Peikoff's perspective on this issue. I don't think that Jefferson was particularly a religious man. And I think that he was mostly just giving lip service to the creator because he thought that that was something that his readers would relate to. And I think that Peikoff is right here, that actually rights derive not directly from the point of the fact that we have a creator, but from the point of the fact of what we are. Now, in Jefferson's mind, and anybody's mind at that time, that was about the same thing. To say that rights derive from our nature and what we are is about the exact same thing as saying they derive from how we've been created by our creator. This is pretty much the same thing. The objectivists are correct that you don't have to demonstrate the existence of a creator in order to demonstrate rights. You just have to look at the nature of man. Rights derive from the fact of man's existence and the requirements of his survival, however he came into being. I agree. I wish that they would be a little bit more thoughtful about the historical role of religion in helping us come to these facts. We could bring in the facts of what is in the Old Testament and the New Testament to help point to these facts. Like, where did our ideas come from about rights? Genesis 9:6, whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed. For God made man in his own image. Something about the nature of what man is has been essential to the idea of rights from the very foundation of society. Every society comes from the line of Noah and his sons. Every society has known from its foundation there's something about the nature of the human being that makes it so that its blood should not be shed, and there is a necessity for justice, the shedding of blood by man for those who shed man's blood. We could look in Exodus, Leviticus, we could look in Romans, we could look in 1 Peter, Matthew. There's lots of passages that I would want to bring into the discussion about what is a government and what rights are. And we'll do that eventually. I want to engage with this objectivist perspective from the point of view of Christianity, but I just want to say it's really shortchanging Christianity to claim no religious society has ever cherished or protected individual freedom. I think only religious societies have ever, in the long range, over a period of 50 or 100 years, ever done anything to protect individual freedom. Just going to reject his claim there. Peacock goes on, in truth, rights are earthly and absolute at the same time because their source is neither God nor the group but reality plus the choice to remain in it. And I think that that's actually correct. Directly speaking, the direct basis for our rights is reality and our choice to remain in it. But you could also think back one step and ask yourself, where did we all come from? And then you'd have the Christian point of view. But that is the key to the whole argument. Summarizing this material on rights, we have a little bit of discussion on the topic of individualism. This will be our last topic in the reading. Individualism is the view that in social issues, the individual is the unit of value. This is a moral corollary of the principle that each man is an end in himself. Politically, as an expression of this approach, an individualist social system is one that upholds individual rights. We spent 9 weeks in the Americanism book study discussing individualism. We came to the conclusion that individualism and Americanism are essentially the same idea. So the opposite of individualism is any morality that values something, anything, above man the individual, and any politics that places any consideration above individual rights. The philosophical competitor of individualism is collectivism, writes Peikoff. Since man exists only to serve other men, it says, individual rights are a myth. The group is the unit of value and the bearer of sovereignty. And Peikoff dismisses collectivism by pointing out that no one can turn a man into a thinking cog because there's no such thing as a thinking cog. You're either thinking or you're a cog. A collectivist system, therefore, like any form of irrationality, is necessarily self-defeating. Now, to add to this, that as you are thinking about whether or not there should be a collectivist system, whether or not people should have the right to produce and trade, dispose of their own property as they choose, should individuals be left free to use their own judgment or not? That's the question that every government theorist is asking. Should the individuals be able to use their own judgment, or should we cancel their judgment, flatten it out, and make the decision 1,000 miles away? Those are the questions that you're discussing when you discuss government. Here, Peikoff compares Rand to Orwell. Orwell mistakenly thought that there could be an industrial civilization that didn't recognize rights, and that it could exist for a long time. Rand actually is more accurate. If you compare 1984 to Anthem, Anthem is a novella by Rand. It shows what happens when people become cogs, what it would really be like. I think it's more logically coherent than 1984. Peikoff writes, when men lose the freedom to think, they lose the products of thought as well. In a society of cogs, you would not have light bulbs, you'd have candles. Concluding this material, Peikoff writes, socialism or communism, they say, is noble in theory, but it is not practical. It surely is not practical. The reason is that it is false and vicious in theory. A unique objectivist point on this. The individual is an autonomous entity whose rights are an absolute. This is a fact which cannot be rewritten. It is a fact with which any true and noble political theory must begin. We have established the idea of individualism. We have established the idea of individual rights. And we understand what violates rights. That is going to lead us to understanding what government is. Government is the agency that protects individual rights. It's the agency that puts force under control, under objective control. And that's where we'll get in the reading next week. In the United States, almost everybody would agree that we have a lot of political corruption, in that we have a two-party system that's becoming like a one-party. It's a uniparty that is working against the people. Why does it happen? We need to understand that. And as I look at the picture on the whole, this idea of individual rights, that's the problem, is that in our society, we do not have laws that uphold individual rights. We have a system of spoils, and we have a system of bribery built into the way that the members of Congress understand their role. They think that it's right for them to be controlling the economy. They think that it's right for them to be handing out favors. And the American people don't reject that. So there's a social problem beyond our problems with the Constitution or our problems with the way the law is set up or the way the legislatures work. There's actually a social problem at the root of all of that. And the social problem is that Americans have not listened to Jethro. In Exodus 18, verses 19 through 21, we see one form of government established in ancient Israel. Jethro talks to Moses and he says, "Now obey my voice. I will give you advice, and God be with you. You shall represent the people before God and bring their cases to God." So this is the role of a judge, even in a secular society. The judge is to bring the cases before principles of right and wrong. Bring their cases to God, and you shall warn them about the statutes and the laws and make them know the way in which they must walk. So we need clear laws. Make them know what they must do. Moreover, look for able men from all the people, men who fear God, who are trustworthy, and who hate a bribe. And place such men over the people as chiefs of thousands, of hundreds, fifties, and tens. So we see in this one case of a government that there should be administration, and the administration should include multiple levels. And that the leaders at all levels, they need to be people who are men, people who fear God, people who are trustworthy, and people who hate a bribe. In the United States today, there are very few people who fear God, who are trustworthy, or who hate a bribe. If we are culture warriors, if we are attempting to change our society, these are the points that we must challenge before we can discuss strategy of the Republican Party, how to purify the Republican Party, how to make sure the Republican Party wins. There's going to be no long-term political victory until we have a society of people who fear God and who are trustworthy, and especially who hate a bribe. Our political system has come to the form that it has today because the American people love a bribe, and because they're willing to elect people that will give them bribes. We get what we choose, and what we have chosen is the American system today. And so as Christians trying to be salt and light in the world, I think our main line of attack, changing our society and our government, ought to be challenging people on the fact that they love bribes. Ayn Rand's political philosophy is going to be useful for that because we can point out what belongs to a person, property rights. If people understood property rights, then they would understand just how much bribery is actually going on. Legal bribery, not under the table, but in plain sight. The laws of our country are laws that redistribute wealth, and that is bribery. That's one benefit that I see in understanding Ayn Rand's political philosophy, is teaching people to think carefully about what is and what is not yours, what is and is not your right. That's where we'll leave off for the video today. We'll have 3 more weeks to discuss and to bring up the question about this connection of force and rights. Eventually, we'll see Rand's theory of government, and it is going to be useful. Whether or not we can establish it in our lifetimes, it is a vision that we should uphold. Even having the correct vision in your mind of what a government should be is going to make you a more just person. It's going to make you the kind of person who can take whatever steps are possible in your lifetime to move toward a society of justice, which we know God cares about and we know we ought to care about too. Thank you for joining us in the recording this week. If anyone wants to watch replays, go to christianintellectual.com/objectivism. I'll talk to you next time. God bless.